Hello again, class. Today we're going to finish our series of lectures on the spirit of change. We're going to keep talking about reform movements. Today we're going to focus on the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. First, the abolitionist movement. All right, so the abolitionist movement, again, remember from our vocabulary, this is a movement to abolish or to end slavery. In a lot of ways, it began in the late 1800s. And so by the very early, it began in the late 1700s, excuse me. And by the early 1800s, many northern states had outlawed slavery. Now, let's go back and review what we learned from our colonial time period, what we've been talking about a lot this year. It was a lot easier for abolitionists to convince northern states to abolish slavery. Why? It's because the northern states' economy wasn't tied up in cash crops, which anytime during that colonial time period and in the early part of America, where you had an economy based on cash crops, you had a large amount of slavery. Right? There was definitely a connection between cash crops and slavery. And so the North's economy did not rely on cash crops, so it was much easier for abolitionists to convince the northern states to outlaw slavery. But the abolitionist movement starts, gaining momentum. They have these successes in the North, and then even going back to the Constitution, because the slave trade compromise. As you recall, in the slave trade compromise, the Constitution basically said the slave trade, the trade from Africa, bringing African slaves to America, could exist for 20 more years, but after that, so in 1807, it would be made illegal. And so abolitionists started thinking, well, look, if starting in 1807, the triangular slave trade that brought slaves from Africa to the Americas could be outlawed, maybe we can go ahead and outlaw all slavery. Now, as you can see, it turns out it's going to be another 60 years and a civil war before that comes to pass. But the abolitionist movement really started picking up momentum at this time period. And some of the strongest supporters of abolition were Quakers. Right? You had a lot of religious groups that were opposed to slavery. Remember our discussion of how the Second Great Awakening led to a lot of these reform movements. You had Christian groups, you had Quakers who were at the forefront of opposing slavery. They often did so on religious reasons. All right, and so what our lesson is going to be on is we're going to touch on a lot of the more famous abolitionists, like this guy named David Walker. All right, he was an African American living in Boston. Right, he wasn't a slave. Right? And he published a pamphlet in 1829 that encouraged slaves to revolt. Now, pretty soon after that, David Walker received death threats, and then he ends up dying under somewhat suspicious or at least unknown reasons right after this. So understand that even though people were living in the North, and this is true for black abolitionists as well as white abolitionists, abolitionists in the North did face certain level of threat and possible violence for their work in the abolitionist movement. And we'll talk about someone else who faced some death threats here in a minute. All right. So, in response to David Walker's pamphlet, the South started passing laws. On one hand, they made it a law. Many states outlawed the spread of abolitionist material. So, in other words, you weren't even allowed to buy or sell David Walker's pamphlet or any pamphlets like it that talked about ending slavery. Now, clearly, this seems to be a pretty blatant and obvious violation of the First Amendment, both freedom of speech and freedom of press. So these laws by the South would have seemed pretty unconstitutional, but nonetheless they passed them. Second, and even worse, they made it illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Many states passed laws that outlawed teaching slaves basically literacy, because if you can read and write, there's a couple things that the South could be worried about there. if someone can read and write, then they can read about how life may be better somewhere else. All right, how there's support in other places to abolish slavery. All right? And if slaves read that and understand that there are people who are sympathetic to their cause, then that may make them more likely to actually try to either run away or to revolt against the slaveholders, etc. The second, and this is probably the bigger fear in terms of the South slaveholders, is if you can read and write, you can communicate. All right, so if the slaves could communicate with one another, with slaves on different plantations, then they could plan a possible slave revolt to attack the slaveholders. They could plan escape routes and things like that. And so the South, who lived in constant fear, especially during this time that there would be a slave revolt, the South started trying to pass a lot of laws to try to make sure that the slaves didn't gain any sort of power or any sort of way to fight back or to escape. The next set of abolitionists we'll talk about are the Grimke Sisters. These are sisters who left their southern plantation home. What makes them unique is here you have these white sisters grew up on a plantation around slavery, and then they became abolitionists. Most of the abolitionists were either former slaves or people in the North, but the Grimke sisters grew up in the South, and they saw slavery up close and personal, and they grew to oppose it, and so they moved to the North and joined an anti-slavery society. And then Angelina's husband, a guy named Theodore Weld, he would send anti-slavery petitions to Congress. So again, you had more and more people taking different routes to slavery. Later we'll talk about the Underground Railroad and that sort of thing. The Grimkes joined societies. Their husband would write to Congress trying to get them to pass new laws and that sort of thing. So you had a lot more organization during this time period that was moving to try to take active steps to abolish slavery. William Lloyd Garrison published a famous abolitionist newspaper called the Liberator. All right, Liberator, think about that, how that word sounds like liberty, right? Which means freedom, right? So the Liberator, that word, it just means to free somebody or something. And that's how he named his newspaper, because they were trying to free the slaves. And he was the person I was talking about earlier, again, living in the North, but he would receive death threats. On at least one occasion, he was almost captured and hanged for his abolitionist activity. All right, so being an abolitionist could sometimes be dangerous during that time period. Next, we have John Quincy Adams. Yes, that John Quincy Adams, who was president once upon a time. Now, whereas most presidents, after they leave office, whether because they retire voluntarily or because they lose an election, they simply retire. They go home, and nowadays they may write a book or learn to paint or play golf or something like that. But John Quincy Adams, he went back to work. He got himself elected to Congress. He was a House member, a representative from Massachusetts, and he spent the next 20, 25 years or so in Congress, and he spent a lot of that effort was opposing slavery. All right, he represented he was a lawyer, so he represented slaves before the Supreme Court on occasion, and he did spend his post-presidency life working against slavery, and throughout his life, and I mean throughout his life, he actually died while in Congress. He basically, I think, had a heart attack, but he just kind of killed over during a debate in Congress one day, and ended up dying there in the Congressional building. So he spent his whole life after his presidency, fighting against slavery. Probably the most famous abolitionist is this man called Frederick Douglass. Now, his slaveholder, contrary to local law, did in fact teach him to read and write when he was a slave. And then he eventually escapes from slavery, and he becomes a leading speaker for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And in 1845, he publishes an autobiography that described his life as a slave. And, here on the next slide, we're going to talk about a lady named Sojourner Truth, who also was a former slave who traveled and told her story and told about slavery. And I think what made these stories so powerful is that they really educated the North on the horrors of slavery. Because however bad you think slavery is, in reality, it was probably about 1,000 times worse. Okay, and so people in the North during this time period, they knew slavery existed, but many of them hadn't been around it. Many of them just didn't understand, or possibly many of them didn't understand just how horrible it is. I mean, they knew it was unfair, but they didn't know how dehumanizing it was, how violent it was, how families were routinely being ripped apart, how slaves would be beaten, for no reason whatsoever. And so, I think people like Frederick Douglass and, Sojourner Truth, and perhaps the Grimke Sisters to a lesser extent because they had lived with slavery, they knew the horrors of slavery and they could educate people in the North. All right, so convince people who before may have not really thought too much about it one way or the other to start taking more active interest in opposing slavery. All right. And Frederick Douglass, like Garrison, published an abolitionist newspaper. Now Douglass called his the North Star. All right, and so why do you think Douglass used this name? All right, well, think about it when someone would run away from slavery, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the Underground Railroad here in 2 or 3 slides. They would do so in secret, so they'd often travel at night, so they could, travel while people were sleeping, so they hopefully wouldn't be seen. And when you're traveling at night and you want to make sure you keep heading north, because that's where the free states were, you'd follow the North Star. Okay, so he called his newspaper the North Star after this idea that the North Star would lead slavery. As I mentioned, Sojourner Truth was another former slave who became an abolitionist. She also escaped slavery. She fled to the Quakers, who were able to set her free, and she later won a court case to free her son from slavery as well. Now let's take a minute to think about her name, or consider her name, because her original name was Isabella, but once she became free, she picked her own name, and she came up with Sojourner Truth. Now we all know what truth means, right? But sojourner, you may not know what that means. It comes from the root word sojourn, which is a journey. So a sojourner is basically someone who's taking a journey or someone who's traveling. All right. So Sojourner Truth is someone who, is either traveling with the truth or to tell the truth, or maybe traveling to find the truth, something like that. So it's a traveler who's seeking out the truth. That's what her name means. And so she did, and so she spent her post-slavery life, traveling around through the North, kind of telling them the truth about slavery. And so she and Frederick Douglass become some of the leading and most famous abolitionists. These former slaves all of a sudden took a leadership position in these anti-slavery institutions. And of course, you had the Underground Railroad. Remember, this is a metaphor for the series of routes runaway slaves could use to escape the North. And these slaves would travel, by foot, by wagons, sometimes boats, sometimes even trains. Probably not a lot on trains, just because, in the 1830s, 1840s, you still didn't have trains covering a whole lot of the country. I mean, they existed, they were there, but they didn't go everywhere in the country. So most of the time, they're probably traveling by foot. That's probably by far the most common, or maybe, hiding out in the back of a wagon or something like that. And so they would travel at night, as I said, and they would hide during the day in places called stations. All right, so think about a train station. What do you do at a train station? You stay there and you wait for the next train, right? Well, these places where they would hide out, places like stables or attics or cellars, These would be considered stations because they're waiting there until the next leg of their journey to go somewhere else. And so again, the Underground Railroad, all the language is often going back to this train metaphor. And this Underground Railroad required lots and lots of people to help, because think about how far someone can walk in one night. Not that far, right? So every night, by the end of the night, the escaped slaves would have to find a new place to hide. And so you had to have a lot of people on this trail, on this route, that were willing to help them. And so that's why most of the slaves who escaped, they did so from the border states, all right, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, places like that, because you didn't have to travel as far. If you're coming from, southern Mississippi or from Texas, you have a long way to travel to get to the free northern states. Okay? But you would have to have a lot of help along the way. And so people like Frederick Douglass would hide, up to 11 runaway slaves at a time. Continuing with this train metaphor, the people who would lead the runaway slaves along this route were called conductors. And the most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman was, helped lots of slaves to escape at a great personal risk to herself. And first of all, Harriet Tubman, suffered the effects of slavery her whole life. When she was about 12 or 13, the person, I don't know if it was the owner of the plantation or just what they called an overseer, someone who would manage it for the owner, cracked her skull up and fractured her skull. And so the rest of her life, she'd basically pass out or have like a seizure in effect. Right? And so she suffered the consequences of slavery her whole life, even after she escaped. When she escaped in 1849, and almost immediately she began helping other slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Right? And she eventually makes at least a total of 19 trips to help free slaves from the South. In the first trip or two, she went back to help her family. But even after that, she kept going back time and time again to help slaves escape. And think about how brave, how much bravery this took. Because if she had been captured, there's a good chance they would have executed her. But if not executing her, they certainly would have beaten her and sent her back to slavery. So she was risking certainly her freedom and quite probably her life in continuing to help others to escape the South to freedom. So this is why she's so incredibly famous, because of the trauma she went through and how much personal risk she took in order to help others. All right, so those are our famous abolitionists. Now, let's talk about the women's rights movement. And again, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to go ahead and tell you how this ends. Women do not get the right to vote until 1920. Okay? In the 1970s, there was a proposed, what they call an equal rights amendment to the Constitution that would basically say, both men and women have equal rights. That was proposed, but not enough states ratified it to become an actual amendment. All right, so, our class, the subject matter of our class is going to end when Reconstruction ends in 1877. So understand, we're not going to, in our class, study the end of the women's rights movement. It's going to continue on and on. But we're going to talk about the start of it. Right. So in the 1800s, women had very few rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't sit on juries, hold political office. In some of the states, married women could not even manage their own property. All right, so if a woman did own property, either by inheriting it from a deceased husband or from their parents or something, once they got married, then basically their husband would take control of that property in many states. Now, and some of the leaders of the women's rights movements had started out in the Abolitionist movement. And often they were not treated very well within the Abolitionist movement. Okay, many of the abolitionists, now not all, not Frederick Douglass, not Garrison, probably not Sojourner Truth, are the Grimke Sisters, but a lot of the leading abolitionists throughout the country, really didn't think women should hold leadership positions in the abolitionist movement. All right? And so some of these women who at first became abolitionists started to work towards women's own rights because they didn't even have the right to help out the abolitionist movement or to at least take a leadership position in it. So they realized, all right, well, we better get our own rights if we're going to help others. All right. So, an example of this is Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went to an anti-slavery convention in London in 1840, but were told they couldn't speak since they were women. All right. And as a side, William Lloyd Garrison, then in solidarity with them, gave up his chance to speak at that convention as well. All right. He said, well, if you're not going to let them speak, then I'm not going to speak as well. So a lot of these women who take central roles in the women's rights movement, they had begun in the abolitionist movement. All right. So Mott and Stanton, all right, later that same decade, organized what's called the Seneca Falls Convention. All right. It's a really big meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. And the most famous event at this convention is that the women there drafted what's called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolution. And it's sort of based on the Declaration of Independence. And it lists several complaints, okay, aka grievances, just like were in the Declaration of Independence, and they demanded their rights for women. All right, so if you look at this famous illustration, political cartoon on the right, you see how the women are sitting on their Declaration of Sentiment boat, and they're about to go over the waterfall into a pool of equality. And you see before them, 1776, when the actual Declaration of Independence was signed, and the Market Revolution, which we're going to talk about in a few lessons, but that's going to sort of, opening up the economy to more people. You see the Second Great Awakening. They're going on these other trends, and they're following these trends towards more equality. And then you see kind of behind other women in kind of those barrels, education, suffrage, so the right to vote, property rights. Those were the different rights that the women at the Seneca Falls Convention wanted. And you finally see at the very back, you see where it says Abolitionist Movement in the water. All right, so they were sort of going in the same direction to get more rights, both for them and for the slaves. All right, so this declaration included a demand for suffrage, all right, which was the right to vote. Now understand, this was actually controversial, even among the women there, because some women were afraid, look, we know men aren't going to let us start voting anytime soon. So if we ask for the right to vote, then they may not take our other demands, like to be educated, to be able to control their own property seriously. So it was kind of controversial, but they did end up asking or demanding suffrage, right to vote. So another famous, member of the women's rights movement was Susan B. Anthony. Right? She becomes, the most famous. She's actually put on a silver dollar in the 1900s called Susan B. Anthony dollars. All right, so she's, I believe the first woman to have her face on American currency. And she used her experience. She had been a member of the temperance movement, the anti-slavery movements, and she would use her experience in those movements to help mobilize and organize the women's movement into a national organization. And her focus was that women need to be able to control their own money and property. Okay? Because if you don't have control of your own money and property, then you really can't be independent. You're always dependent on the person who controls your property. Right? Because you need property, you need some money to live, to be able to buy food, to buy a house, that sort of thing. And so she argued that for women to be independent, they first need the right to control their property. Okay? So she supported laws that gave married women the right to their own property and wages. So, again, I know that was short, but that's the kind of a summary of the women's rights movement. Because look, this women's rights movement, it got started in the 1830s and 1840s in this time period, but it's really not going to have a lot of successes until the 1900s. That's when women become more likely to be able to go to colleges. They get the right to vote in 1920, and they gain a lot of these rights that we're talking about here in the 1830s and 40s. Women don't actually achieve that for another 50 or in some cases almost 100 years. All right, so, and that's true for a lot of these movements we've talked about. The seeds were planted, here in the early 1800s, but the successes really came much later. Okay? All right, so that's the end of our Spirit of Change and our reform lessons. I believe the next series of lectures we're going to do is going to be on the economy. We'll talk about the market revolution, the industrial revolution, and how that changed the economy, and then different technologies that came about.